Malik's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, always taught him the importance of helping around the house, so every Saturday, he took out the trash just before sunset. On this particular evening, Malik was walking out of his family's front yard with a trash bag in hand, whistling a tune he'd heard on the radio that morning. The sky was dimming, and lights were beginning to flicker on in houses up and down the street. As he reached the curb to toss the trash into the bin, a police cruiser slowly rolled down the street. Inside the car sat Officer Maurice of the Masonville Police Department. Officer Maurice was known for his stern face and quick judgments. He squinted out his window, watching Malik, then stopped the car with a quick jerk. "Hey, kid!" he shouted, stepping out of the cruiser and adjusting his belt. Malik froze, holding on to the trash bag tightly. "What are you doing out here?" Officer Maurice asked with a sharp voice, and Malik, taken by surprise, stammered as he tried to answer. I'm just taking out the trash, sir," he managed to say, with a soft but steady voice. But the officer wasn't convinced. Morris's gaze narrowed as he looked Malik up and down, not hearing a single word. Instead, he grumbled, "Drop the bag and put your hands behind your back." Malik's face fell, confusion setting in as he let the trash bag drop, his hands shaking slightly. Mrs. Jackson, who had been in the kitchen washing dishes, noticed the flashing red and blue lights through the window. Concern flashed across her face as she moved closer to the window, realizing that the lights were right outside her home. She saw Officer Maurice and her son standing there and felt a chill run through her. Rushing outside, Mrs. Jackson called out, "Officer, what's going on?" "That's my son!" But Officer Maurice ignored her, continuing to pat Malik down. He firmly told her, "Step back, ma'am. Your son is a suspect." Mrs. Jackson, now standing with her hands on her hips, protested. "A suspect? He was just taking out the trash." Several neighbors began to gather, watching as Malik was taken to the back of the police cruiser, his hands restrained behind him. Despite the pleas from his mother and neighbors, Officer Maurice pushed Malik into the car without a second glance. The car's door slammed shut, and with a cold look, Officer Maurice drove off into the evening, leaving a silent crowd behind. The Jackson family's house felt unusually quiet after the police car drove away. Mrs. Jackson's shock turned to anger as she rushed inside to make a call. Malik's father, Mr. Jackson, was a calm man by nature, but the sight of his son being taken away for simply taking out the trash had him furious. Word spread quickly across Masonville. Neighbors exchanged whispers, shocked by what had happened. The police department received dozens of calls, each one demanding to know why a young boy had been detained without reason. In the local diner, elderly Mrs. Hensley spoke up to her friends. "I saw the whole thing. That officer had no reason to take that poor boy away." The town was buzzing with outrage. Meanwhile, at the Masonville Police Department, Officer Maurice was busy filling out paperwork, ignoring the growing noise. "Just a precaution," he muttered to himself, justifying his actions. But he didn't notice the rising number of messages coming in on his phone, nor did he see the emails piling up from his supervisors asking for an explanation. Back at the Jackson household, Mrs. Jackson had contacted a lawyer, Mr. Lewis, known for taking on cases of injustice. Mr. Lewis was quick to act, filing a formal complaint and preparing to demand Malik's immediate release. "This is an outright violation of rights," Mr. Lewis assured the Jacksons. "We're going to make sure Officer Maurice faces the consequences for this." As night fell, the situation escalated. A local news station caught wind of the story, with headlines reading, "12-year-old detained while taking out trash." People from neighboring towns began sharing their frustration on social media. By morning, the story had spread to the point that the Masonville Police Department had no choice but to respond. The department's phones were ringing nonstop, and the sheriff himself, Sheriff Wade, was notified of the situation. Sheriff Wade, a fair and respected man, knew his officers needed accountability. He was also aware that this was more than just a misunderstanding. "Get Maurice in my office," he instructed his assistant firmly. "I want to hear every detail of what happened." Across town, Officer Maurice received a call. "Report to the station now." The sheriff's voice boomed over the line. Maurice's heart sank, but he tried to act confident, muttering to himself that he was just doing his job. Little did he know, Masonville was rallying behind Malik, and justice was brewing. The sheriff's office was tense as Officer Maurice entered. Sheriff Wade sat at his desk, his gaze sharp. "Maurice, explain why a 12-year-old boy taking out his trash was considered a suspect in your eyes." Maurice fumbled for words, eventually mumbling. "He looked suspicious. Just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." But Sheriff Wade wasn't buying it. "Suspicious for what, Maurice? For being a kid in his own yard?" The tension grew as Malik's lawyer, Mr. Lewis, entered the office with Mr. and Mrs. Jackson. Behind them, a few journalists stood with cameras ready. Sheriff Wade took a deep breath. "Officer Maurice, you'll be placed on immediate suspension pending further investigation. This department won't tolerate behavior like this." The relief on Mrs. Jackson's face was evident. She turned to Mr. Lewis, thanking him for his help. But the story wasn't over. The Jackson family had decided to press charges against Officer Maurice. "This isn't just about Malik," Mrs. Jackson said, addressing the journalists. "It's about every child in this community who deserves to feel safe in their own home." The people of Masonville continued to show support for Malik. The Jacksons received calls from families across town, expressing their sympathy and offering support. Malik, who had been shaken by the ordeal, found strength in knowing his town was behind him. News stations across the country picked up the story, making sure that what happened in Masonville would not be forgotten. Officer Maurice, once seen as a figure of authority, faced consequences he had never anticipated. His actions became a lesson to others about the importance of accountability and respect for every individual, no matter their age or background. And as for Malik, he returned to his peaceful life in Masonville, but he was no longer the same quiet boy he had been before. He had become a symbol of resilience and justice for his entire community. This brings us to the end of this story. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Kindly subscribe for more thrilling stories. Like and share this video. Have a nice day.